Buenos días, gracias a todos por asistir. En breve vamos a dar inicio.
Thank you very much for joining us. We will begin momentarily. We're fixing the reason why we're in a delay, so thank you for your patience.
Muy buenos días. Vamos a dar.
Good morning. We will begin with our first panel of our last day of activities of our colloquium. We would like to welcome Diego Enrique Osorno, Anabel Hernandez, Guillermo Osorno, and Guillermo Montemayor, our moderator for today. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be the moderator for today's panel, but it's not my pleasure to address the topic that we will discuss, and that is journalists being harassed. We shouldn't be talking about that, but it is a reality. Let me tell you that every guest, every speaker will have 10 to 15 minutes to talk about the subject matter that you decide to address. And the idea is to open up a dialogue with you, and our floor staff will have cards available for you. And the three of you can decide what to delve into after each panelist shares his or her mind about the subject. So, I have the pleasure to introduce, ladies first, Anabel Hernandez. Well, Anabel Hernandez is a writer and a Mexican journalist. Most of you have heard about her. I'm sure you read her pieces. In 2001, she received the National Journalism Award. In 2003, received an acknowledgement by UNICEF on her coverage of girl slaves in the Mexico-U.S. border. And she contributes to MX, Reporte Indigo, Reforma, and Proceso magazines. The Señores del Narco in 2010 detailed complicity between drug dealers, business people, and the government has been the cause of many threats. Her latest work are México en Llamas, El legado de Calderón 2012, y La verdadera noche de Iguala, the story that the government tried to conceal in 2016. Welcome, Anabel. Thank you. We also have with us Guillermo Osorno, namesake, welcome. Journalist, co-founder of the magazine Horizontal, author of the book Tengo que morir todas las noches in 2014, studied in Columbia University and worked from the U.S. Embassy to London. He said he quitted a diplomatic career to become a journalist. Do you regret it? No. He's the founder of the Mapas Publishing House and the magazine Travesías. He's been a reporter for Reforma, director of Gato Pardo, and currently he's a columnist for Universal. Welcome. Diego Enrique Osorno, reporter and Mexican writer, has been witness and narrator of the top 21st century conflicts in Mexico and Latin America, has been awarded with the A Mano Disarmata Prize from the Stampa Romana from Italy, the Latin American Award on Journalism on Drugs, the International Journalism Award for the 35 years of Proceso, and the National Journalism Prize 2013 dedicated to the Zapatista National Liberation Army. His books are El Cartel de Sinaloa, La Guerra de los Zetas, and Contra Estados Unidos have been included in the annual lists of nonfiction publications in Diario Reforma magazine. He has in filmmaking, El Alcalde with international awards, and initiatives to reconstruct social fabric with the site puebloantiguo.com. In Oaxaca, he covered crimes against humanity, and also he has investigated officials involved in torture, has taught at Monterrey University, and he publishes every week for Más por Más. Welcome. Very well. Leonardo Curcio apologizes because he just couldn't be here with us sharing this panel. I'm Guillermo Montemayor, the advocate for the audience of TV UNAM. And how should I start, Annabelle? Journalism under harassment. This is one of the ways that the state uses for centuries ago to exclude and include. There is a way to include and a way to exclude journalists. So this siege upon journalisms that have peaked in the last decade, I would say, has many nuances. There is a direct threat, there is money, there are attempts to co-opt the work of journalists, there are layoffs, there are many, many ways to harass a journalist. It's not only a threat, a physical threat, a verbal threat that is used, and even a death threat. Many journalists have died in our country. On the other hand, there is impunity. There is no protection. The investigation by the judiciary is poor, and the mechanisms in place are quite bizarre. And we don't see a powerful state in terms of protecting journalists to prevent violence against journalists. And what comes to mind, Annabelle, if everybody else agrees, I would ask you, Annabelle, why is it important and why should we have an act to protect journalists? Because there are acts for the protection of all citizens, for women, for children. And many countries have had to pass an act to protect journalists. But what are the reasons, Annabelle?
Before anything else, let me thank UNAM for organizing this very important fora. Really, the people who've been coming to the different events are very high-ranking people. I think these are things that should be discussed in Mexico, especially in this very important, or the most important, higher studies institution. I am quite concerned. I was hoping this auditorium would be full, but this is a symptom of why journalists are being murdered once and once more in Mexico, because I think that even Mexican society does not understand what it implies, number one, as a human being, as a journalist, to be subject every day, constantly, 24 hours a day, to thinking you have a gun on your head and you don't know if you're waking up tomorrow. But the gravest thing is that people do not understand the importance of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is an elementary measure that shows if a nation, a country, is democratic or not. And we would have to start out through the diagnosis, which is quite clear. In Mexico, we're talking about 110 journalists murdered, 11 only this year, over 45 in the 6-year administration of this Sir Mr. Enrique Peña Nieto. I would like to read something for the audience. This is what I prepared for Cambridge University a few weeks ago, where I participated talking exactly about these problems of freedom of expression, of freedom of speech, not only at the general level, because the problem, I believe, is that when people see people dying, journalists getting killed, and the millions of Mexican citizens that have impunely been killed in this last decade particularly, perhaps we only see the number, but we do not see the face of the victim. In this presentation made in Cambridge and other universities of the world, I want people to connect to what a citizen, a journalist lives every day, subject to this threat of death, this death threat every day. Unfortunately, this is my case, and this is also the case of many Mexican journalists who every day want to wage this fight, the struggle, not for us. This struggle is for you to defend your freedom, for the freedom of speech, that is. Let me read this part. Yes, please. Let me just say something here. These conferences are being broadcasted and streaming, and many people are watching us, yes. And the previous conference was seen by over 15,000 people. So, yes, all those that are watching at home, Thank you so much for having us. Thank you for watching. Thank you. Please, Annabelle. Yes, thank you. A death is in my life with the same persistence as the story of victims of corruption and serious violations of human rights that I cannot stop investigating and publishing. One thing leads to another, and there's nothing I can do about it. I cannot escape this. I don't want to keep silent. My silent means being accomplice of impunity and violence in my country, Mexico. I'm a Mexican journalist. I in this work for 24 years now, and for 12 years now, I do specific investigations on the links of political business power with drug cartels, forced disappearances, systematic torture in Mexico. I have given voice to victims. I've revealed proof of these crimes, and I've talked about presidents of Mexico's state secretaries, police forces, and the military. As part of this work, since 2010, I'm sentenced to death in Mexico. A powerful group of police, corrupt heads who are still in power order my death because I discovered their links with the Sinaloa cartel that according to the U.S. government, is the most powerful drug trafficking organization. Since then, I live with escorts 24 hours a day, if that's what you can call living, of course. In the last 7 years, that desire of killing me, we now have the desire of many other public officials because they're so uncomfortable with my work that I continue carrying out every day. They are always harassing me, and I don't stop investigating. But my story is only an example of what every day hundreds of journalists in Mexico are going through because they dare say the truth in the face of the murderers and the corrupt people and those who abuse power. I have lived, I have survived, but over 115 Mexican journalists have been murdered in the last decade, and over 18 have been disappeared in Mexico. Their voices and the reportage are not listened to, are not read anymore. Jose Armando Rodriguez was executed in Ciudad Juarez November 13th in his car before the eyes of his 8-year-old daughter. A subject shot him to death. And Maria Esther Aguilar, wife and the mother of 2 girls, disappeared 11 November 2009 in Michoacan. We don't know her whereabouts. Evaristo Pacheco Solis, another reporter, his corpse was found in 2010 March in one of the roads of the state of Guerrero. 5 shots, 1 in his head and 4 more in his chest. Juan Francisco Rodriguez Rio from Guerrero and his wife Maria Elvira Hernandez were executed with 4 shots. June 28, 2010, in Internet Cafe. Regina Martinez, correspondent in Veracruz, was murdered in her own house in Jalapa, April 29, 2012. She was hit in her face and body. She died strangled and asphyxiated. May 3, 2012, World Day of Press Freedom in Veracruz. In garbage bags, they found the remains of 3 journalists and one of the girlfriends, Esteban Rodriguez, Garbel Hute, Guillermo Luna, and Iracema Becerra. Before being murdered, they were brutally tortured, and then they were dismembered. The photographer Ruben Espinosa was killed July 31, 2015, in an apartment here in Mexico City. He was found naked and killed at gunpoint. And another journalist, September 14th, 2016, when he was driving his car, he made it alive in the hospital, but he died in the hospital. March 27th of this year, Miroslava was shot to death in her car when she was leaving home in the city of Chihuahua, taking her son to school, who was sitting right next to her, and he saw her die. In Mexico, freedom of the press doesn't exist. If those dare executing, implementing it, they live under threat or they are shot to death. Mexico has become one of the most dangerous countries for journalism in Mexico because it's different to tell who's more risky. What is riskier? to talk about a narco trafficking or to talk about a public official or corrupt businessman. Most of the times they work together. They are one and the same thing. They eat on the same table. They sleep in the same bed and they share the same booty. And you, the citizens, the truth is how uncomfortable can what people are so uncomfortable with is that Mexico, the 15th economic power of the world, that is being seen by international community as a democracy opening its doors to deliver juicy profits of oil. It's a state without a law, no justice in Mexico, where over 120,000 people have been murdered. 128,000 have been 28,000 have been disappeared, and this is the smell of corruption and impunity in Mexico. The tears of those who stay behind cannot hide this infamy. Attacks against the press in Mexico happen every day, everywhere, anytime. The main people affected are not the media. The main is not the journalists. The main victim of those aggressions is society itself. And those who kill or who order the death of journalists in Mexico have the main objective of killing the fundamental right of society to be informed with veracity. If the media and the journalists are silent, or if they are quiet down, as it's happened in many places in Mexico, society doesn't have enough elements to make decisions. And without the right information, authentic information to make decisions, there is no freedom. And if there's no freedom, there's no democracy. De Balzac used to say a phrase: there's an official story. It's a lying story. It is taught. But there's also a secret story where we find the true causes of events, of happenings, a shameful story. The Mexican narco state builds this story every day. It puts makeup on it and it maneuvers with it to cover up impunity in the corrupt system in Mexico. Our responsibility as journalists is to find truth and to tell people about it, no matter what it costs, no matter at which expense, no matter what. One of the terrible things happening in the last decades is the case of the 43 disappeared students of Ayotzinapa in Iguala. They were disappeared, and the case hasn't been resolved, although the authorities understand and know clear, and they have proved that it was the military of the 27th Battalion of Infantry of Iguala and at least 14 federal police and 5 police of the ministerial police forces and different policemen of the state of Guerrero at the state level and also of the Iguala municipality who participated in even this event is impugned. 98% of the crimes in Mexico is in this situation. Impunity, a situation of impunity. Why then is it that journalists in Mexico have become the target of these murders, of these attacks, of these intimidations? Because since in Mexico there is no rule of law, since there is no justice, since the Attorney General's office and the State Prosecutor's office and the tribunals, the courts, and at all levels, even the Supreme Court of Justice, give way to this type of impunity, unfortunately, Mexican journalists, and I'm saying unfortunately because this is not the role we want to play. At least I don't want to play this role. We've become a sort of prosecutors, fiscals, prosecutors. We've started doing this at the last 10 years. We're doing the work that would be corresponding to be done by an attorney general to find the truth and to defend the rights of victims to that truth and to say exactly who the responsible people are for those murders and crimes in this country. Since the government, however, and the institutions are colluded so that this truth is now known. We, the journalists who have this commitment with citizens, have been doing this work. And the death of journalists has to do with this role of sort of prosecutors, involuntary prosecutors, and this is what we've become. And that's what's given way to these murders, to these homicides. If you ask me, you can ask me about this legislation. Why is it necessary for this legislation to exist? I can tell you this law exists in Mexico as a clear example of the deficiency of the state. In Europe, in many modern countries, this legislation is not necessary. Why not? Why doesn't this? Because there's freedom of speech. In Mexico, this legislation exists as a sort of simulation. I have to say this very openly because I, at least since 2008, I have been submitting different complaints, different criminal claims, penal claims of the threats that I have received, of the armed attacks that my family has suffered, of the murder of key sources of information that had given me valuable information. Now they're dead. And in spite of all the claims that I've submitted, until now, there's not even one person detained. No one is being interrogated, even though there are videos of aggressions, the attacks, the threats, and even pictures of the drawings of the attackers. This is just to wash the face of the Mexican government in the face of the international community, saying, yes, we're protecting journalists. What type of protection can this be? The law started functioning since the Vicente Fox administration. One way or the other, those were the first mechanisms to protect journalists in Mexico. The Fox administration ended with 35 journalists killed. The Calderon administration, 60 journalists killed. And the Peña Nieto government, it's not over yet, is 45 journalists killed. How many of these cases have been resolved? None. In the case, for instance, of Regina Martinez, the detentions that were made, there is proof that the alleged responsible were innocent people and they were tortured to say that they had committed something they never committed. So we're saying that these mechanisms, although they do exist in legislation, although it is a federal crime to kill journalists, it's no good. Why isn't it no good? Why is it no good? Because there's no will of the government to protect journalists. I insist, because journalists, we are having to play this role as prosecutors to inquire and do investigation on crimes, not only individual crimes of the kidnappings, not only talking about crimes committed by the cartels of drugs. We're saying that principally the main 5 massacres in Mexico, Tlatlaya, Yotzinapa, Apatzingan, Tanoato, and what happened in Oaxaca against the teachers, they were resolved cases, or at least in terms of the truth. It wasn't really the government. The truth was known because of the journalists, the work they did. And in the case, for instance, of Tlatlaya, it was AP journalists and some other journalists. At Ayotzinapa, many of us journalists have presented proof, evidence, videos, testimonials, and forensic tests, ballistic tests, saying that the army shot the students that night. In the case of Apatzingan, Laura Castellanos was also able to prove through videos, and she did research saying that the attackers in Michoacan had been the federal police against the vigilante groups at the community levels, and then also in other places the massacres were known, and the evidence was known because of the journalists. In Jalisco, for instance, if I'm not mistaken, the case of Oaxaca, when the federal police was denying this, they say we never shot. Once more, news agencies, information agencies showed that yes, the policemen were shooting at the teachers. So that's why we have so much impunity. That's why this legislation is just a simulation. That is why this legislation, for me particularly, it would be better for it not to exist. Because if it's only a mechanism, a very perverse mechanism to simulate they're doing something many times. For instance, I go give conferences internationally. People are asking me, but you have protections in Mexico. But you do, but Anabel, you're in the protection mechanism. That's true, I am. Why am I in the protection mechanism? Because at least the Mexican government, if anything happens to me, there will be no doubt that it was the government of Mexico who did this. What's happened to many of our colleague journalists who've been murdered? For instance, Ruben Espinosa, when he was brutally massacred here in Mexico City, the pretext of the government was we offered help. We offered protection when he left Veracruz, and he never wanted to get this protection. It's practically saying, well, he got killed because he wanted, because he's an idiot. He's an idiot. That's why he got killed. And many people, for instance, were under this protection. Even under protection, they've been killed. One of them this year. This mechanism is quite perverse. It doesn't work, and it would be better for the Mexican society and for the international community for this legislation not to exist. Because yes, it would be very evident, and there would be no doubt whatsoever that the Mexican government is killing journalists because we're revealing, because we're inconvenient, because revealing the doings of this narco state, this narco government, and the government doesn't want anyone to know about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Diego, we've heard from Annabelle's account. She did a very good job summarizing the situation. What is your own experience? What is your take? Let's say if we hadn't an act like this one, what should journalists do instead if we hadn't this act to protect journalists? Because when journalists are killed, there is a lot of fear between the peer journalists, the owners of news outlets, the families of journalists who are always with a pressing concern about their relatives in their minds. So what can we do? What do you have in mind, you who have been directly affected? I do share such a concern and Annabelle's views. I do understand that our job as journalists, well, it's always been a source of discomfort. It's always been pressured. It's always been harassed since day one in journalism. Not a single important journalist that we've heard about, that we admire, has been free from harassment. No one has been free from pressure, and many of those who we don't know about, they've always felt it in their everyday lives. I second the idea of the true idea of a journalist, because people might see themselves as journalists, but they're not journalists. A journalist is someone against power. So you have to be challenging in your nature, and that is going to create problems. And I've never met a great journalist with a peaceful and mellow life. And to me, it is very painful because I've lived attacks. I've been witness of how journalists have been murdered. I've seen it with my eyes, but trying to see the big picture. Let's say all of these years where I've been a reporter, I started 1998, 1999, probably the year 2000. And it coincides with a moment in this country where there is alternation in power. There is a promise for democracy. And I asked myself a question, what is the balance here? And as Annabelle was speaking, more questions came to my mind, and I'm going to share these questions openly while I was hearing Annabelle, because in these 17 years, I've seen a less authoritarian and less corrupt regime in the formal sense of the word. Last century, for example, we have only one political party, one single establishment that had a very hard line approach to power. They controlled media outlets, and they had a very strong corporate power. And from the year 2000 and on, in formal terms, we have more democracy, in the sense that there are more political parties, you can have more options. Now we have independent candidates running for office. And I do believe that, yes, there's more freedom of expression, in the sense that 30 years ago, Proceso was a drop in the middle of the ocean, a very special drop in the ocean. La Jornada made its effort, and it was very hard to do what we do. We have Annabelle, we have Marcela Turati, Lidia Cacho, and in many other places in the world, we have local journalists who are exercising their freedom of speech. There are more freedoms, yeah, there are more liberties, yet it's true, but more than ever, at the same time, in this democratic process, we have seen a step back. I don't know, and there's more barbaric acts than ever. There's more freedom of expression, but as a paradox, we see more journalists being killed in Mexico. So there's more daring journalists, I would say, but every certain minutes, journalists are attacked every 20 hours. So there's no one day in Mexico where journalists are not attacked somehow. So it is a problem for me. I just can't understand things yet. I like to pose myself questions to try to understand what is happening. And I have always tried to see how Mexican democracy today produces more barbaric acts than any dictatorship in the past in Latin America. It produces more violent murders, more torture, more disappearances than any classic Latin American dictatorship. So in my time as a journalist, let's say back in the year 2001, I was 20 years of age. I went to the first funeral of a friend of mine, Felix Fernandez. Well, he was included in the list recently, in the list of journalists, because he was not considered a reporter, because he wrote for a magazine from Miguel Aleman in Tamaulipas. He was questioning the mayor of Miguel Aleman, so he was really into it. I met him in an operation. He was the first people talking about Zetas, so people thought that I was fabricating information. No, that's the cartel of the El Golfo cartel. So I was living in Monterrey then. I worked with him. Then I came back. He was very happy because we had published some pieces. And in December, while exiting a restaurant, he was killed. And his case, as Annabelle clearly put it, was not investigated, and he was debased, he was criminalized, and something else happens here. Well, the journalists who got killed, they should have been part of the criminal gang. They should have done something wrong. So, well, you have to do your job, and you have to join yourself with certain people, but doesn't mean that you're part of it. So in 2002, I had to leave the country. And then when the big boss who sent a threat to me was sent in jail, so I was able to come back. But I saw the emergence of the Special Prosecutor's Office for Journalism now going back to simulations and these bureaucracies that are created in Oaxaca, in the uprisal in 2006, which was, in my opinion, it was an uprisal against Ulises Ruiz government, but it was also an uprisal that made us wake up from that dream that this is not a democracy. I remember 2001, 2000, we described how Mexico was an advanced and democratic country, but then we see Oaxaca and this uprisal, and we realize that this type of authoritarianism and this regime are still present. So while I was doing my job, on October 27, the government creates this police forces dressed as civilians, and they clash between demonstrators. We were covering that, and an American journalist from Indymedia, Brad Will, gets into an alley where they were shooting against demonstrators trying to reach the town hall. I was there. Several journalists were together. So one of the photographers, Armando Ramirez, with me, was shot. So I take him out from the combat zone, and I see how Brad Will falls to the floor. And I remember the adrenaline, how confusing that moment was, and then we realized that he managed to film in video when he was shot. So he had on film the faces of his attackers. So the fact that he was a U.S. citizen, we thought justice is going to be made. And what happened? And this was crazy, as it can be, because right there, the impunity pact became stronger between the PRI and the PAN, between the federal government, the PAN. Then Vicente Fox, in an interview, he agreed with that. Yeah, there was a pact made in order to protect themselves mutually, the both parties together. And this case would have been left in oblivion, but then Calderon negotiations with the Merida Initiative happens. So then there's a claim that Brad Will's case had to be investigated. So the special prosecutor was created, and then it was unbelievable that Brad Will's friend was detained, a detractor from Ulises Ruiz government, and he is in prison as he was the one perpetrated the attack. So they are using this case to punish someone because they wanted someone in jail to have the Merida Initiative progressing. So in my experience as a journalist, for a long time I've realized that institutions are not going to protect journalists in their work. So I had it clear in my mind from that day on. And then I realized that the situation in 2002, I had to leave the country because apparently it was a threat from the Sinaloa cartel big boss. It was a fabrication from the Nuevo Leon's prosecutor's office, so I would decide to leave. So in 2007, 2008, I got notice of that. So basically, in my job, I see that there is some certainty, and I cannot escape from that. In this democracy, in this barbaric democracy that we have with this state institutions, with this impunity pact that the establishment has decided to have, we journalists won't be in a position to defend ourselves from what is happening. And I have to be very honest, I stepped into this situation where I decided myself, okay, I'm going to tell stories. I'm going to forget about that. I know that more of my friends are going to get killed. Baron from La Laguna, he had a list of corrupt police officers. So before he published it in front of his children, he was shot by Torreon police officers. More people close to me got killed, and I kept doing my job. In some sense, I was in shock. I didn't know how to cope with this situation. But when Javier Valdez was killed 7 months ago, was the straw that broke the camel's back for me and for many other people. Javier was not only my friend, but he was one of the best journalists in Mexico. And he was exceptional. He was a great father, a great husband, a great friend, a great journalist, and his killing really shook me. So I decided to step out from this momentum, and I decided to do something. And Carla Marina, luckily from Horizontal, I was talking to Carmen Aristegui that day of the killing, and she said, come on, we're not going to weep eternally. Let's do something. And we talked to Guillermo to create this agenda of journalists that Guillermo has led with a lot of resistance, but he's done a very good job. And that's the way. We have to organize as journalists to protect ourselves. An act is not going to protect us. A mechanism is not going to protect us. A special prosecutor's office is not going to protect us. I believe that the circumstances that we're facing today and the type of country we're living in and the type of democracy makes us find a way to protect ourselves. And that is the road onwards. Yes, it always makes me feel concerned. Yes, that we journalists, yes, we are working in many initiatives. We're moving on, but as I was telling to Annabelle, the search for truth in Mexico entails a risk. You can die in the effort, and it's not only for journalists, academics, lawyers, activists. The ordinary people are at risk. I remember that one of the conversations that I had with Javier was about Miriam Rodriguez, a lady from Tamaulipas. Her daughter was disappeared some years ago. So then she fundraised, she asked for a loan, and she found her daughter in a mass grave in Tamaulipas. She felt relieved that at least she was able to bury her children and had some certainty, but then she decided to investigate and found who killed her. and she managed to do it. It was amazing. She did her research, and she managed to have those people in jail. But at some point, they escaped from prison, and on May the 10th, they pay a visit and kill her. So this lady, that given her personal tragedy, becomes a prosecutor, a detective, and does that job. And she becomes like a DA, because sometimes it's very difficult without proof, and she presented proof and she's killed. So those stories are present all over the country, but not many of these stories are heard. So I believe that at some point, this effort that we journalists are doing to defend ourselves and to fight for journalism, because that equals defending truth without any dogma involved. That search that probably will never come to an end, but that search of would give us a reason to explain the truth, not for an elite, for everybody. I mean, for anyone who is looking for the truth. We have to be together in that sense. And I believe that it's nonsense to hope that the Mexican state eventually protects journalists.
Yes. Guillermo, they say that the first victim of any war is truth. And there are truths, or the search for truth, that are extremely dangerous. This that Diego is proposing, or everything you are doing, how does it work? Is there any progress being made? Is it a light, a hope, to mitigate this harassment against journalists? Because you've, Abel and Diego, have spoken about experiences, murders, killings, but there are so many other means through which journalists can be silenced, to buy them, to threaten them through many other ways. So there has to be a very sound basis in your convictions not to fall into temptations. How is this organized, horizontal? How is it? What progress can we have? Yes, the meeting that they've mentioned, up to that meeting, most of the initiatives of journalists had come from NGOs, civil society organizations, and particularly from attorneys' organizations that are interested in freedom of expression issues. And in the face of humanitarian emergency as of 2008, there was a disruption of violence in Mexico, and an eruption and attacks against journalists, and journalists getting killed. So we went into making two demands. One is the protection mechanism on one hand, and the other one, in hindsight, what Anabel and Diego have said, what we feel is a sort of small victory, insignificant victory, because this is a very big simulation. We know that the protection mechanism has enormous deficit, enormous difficulties. It places journalists in a horrible place, and the protection legislation is just on paper. There's enormous impunity. None of the cases are resolved, although there are special prosecutor's office, special prosecutors, and this is what I wanted to mention, and this is where a lot of the cases are being taken, and this is where the fight is also being waged. But those prosecutors' offices are not well structured. There are prosecutors that I think have the goodwill to do things, but they have no means to do it. They have no impact. So then we find ourselves with two things: the prosecutor's office, the special prosecutor, and the protection mechanisms. That's what we're seeing. And through time, more journalists are getting killed and more journalists are being threatened. the idea to get together as journalists, the way we did in the Journalists Agenda program, is for us to be able to identify a common agenda to protect ourselves. This was a convening process as of a WhatsApp group that had a initial concretion of 4 or 5 people. Then we started calling on other people, convening others, and 40 different organizations became part of this need of journalists to discuss their own agenda to defend themselves. After 3 weeks, we had after 2 weeks, we had like 250 requests to participate, and this it took us by surprise completely, because initially we thought we would just be 50 or 60 people, and normally the people who attend the demonstrations, marches out in the street, protests against the intimidation of journalists. But all of a sudden we have 250 people that were part of the panel discussions that we organized. After 4 weeks, we had 600 people registered, and in a very expedite fashion, we were able to get a place to receive this amount of people that wanted to discuss those issues. And we ended up being 388 people. Not everyone participated, not everyone appeared, but 380 people in a 3-day event. For many, this meant at least a change in the narrative. We were very hurt, as Diego said, because of Javier Valdez's death, a personal friend of all of us, and the threat this signifies also for a publication that I greatly admire, Rio 12, that has been a light in how we should be reporting violence, narco-trafficking, right in the cradle of narco-trafficking, Culiacan. And in those 3 days, there was a combination of grief, of pain because of Javier Valdez's murder, but also a renewed sensation saying we journalists can find this common agenda. It wasn't Agenda de Periodistas, the journalists' agenda, was not an exercise of big or great major exposés or speeches or pronouncements. We found and we chose a method that really worked, where we picked a group of international moderators to help those of us that were there to think long term. What exactly we wanted as a country, as a group of professionals, as a guild to protect ourselves. This gave us a certain light guidance to move forward in our discussions. And we ended up with a document after the 3 days' work, and that this will be disclosed very soon, this document, I mean. And if I read it retrospectively, there is a very important dialogue of all those people who participated, and it has to do with what we are, what it is that we want. And many things came out, not only things related specifically to violence or killings, but many other things about other violences. Let me talk about 2 of them. One has to do with the labor situation of journalists. We discussed it at great length. We discussed the conditions in which journalists do their work. And I think that to a certain degree, violence against journalists and the sensation, the sense of being able to kill someone and nothing ever happens, it doesn't really matter. This has to do with the relationship of journalists with the medium in which they work. The big enemies of journalists appeared clearly as the owners of the media, because in this country, the owners of the media really receive, and this is something we have seen today in a very clear fashion with the reports of official advertising and the Article 19 claims, where the Supreme Court of Justice has demanded Congress to legislate over impunity. That's how serious this is. Well, until today, the owners of the media have a perverse relationship with the government because those media live off government publicity and not of their readers. So therefore, journalists are fodder. Their material, that in the eyes of the media, there's material that doesn't really matter. So labor conditions appeared in a very protagonistic fashion in those discussions we held. Something else that appeared, derived also from this perverse relationship of the media owners with the government, is the prestige of journalists. Listening to Diego and Anabel, I hear this ethics, these efforts made by journalists to find the truth, etc. But I also believe that society has a distorted vision of journalists as dealers of information because they receive money and they publish their version of the truth. And this is another concern of our profession. We feel we need to converse. That's why I'm so happy to be here with society to talk about our role. You started out by saying, why is there a protection law? What is this legislation protecting? As we've said, it's protecting the right to information. If there are no journalists, doing their work with ethics and responsibility, then society would not be informed, could not be informed, and therefore there is no democratic system, which is complete. I think these two items are key in the journalists' agenda program, and they are part of this very extensive document, which was the result of this. The difficult thing, however, now for us, after 3 days of discussion and over 300 people, is how to design an actionable agenda, actionable that doesn't want to overthrow the current regime. Although many would want this to happen, this is not the role of the profession of journalists, of this guild we're part of. This is not part of our purposes at the professional level. So then the interesting thing has been how to interpret this journalist's agenda to turn it into an organization that works. And we've had internal conversations on how to go about putting this information for something that's feasible, something of use. And we thought, and this is something we've discussed, that we have to create a coordinating body for journalists, a national coordinating body for journalists to do various things. One of them would be adjust the work done by many other organizations of protection for journalists. There are many organizations, and we feel coordination is necessary, and it has to do with national coordination as well. Not long ago, I was in a meeting of journalists convened by the Mexico City administration as part of a forum of the Mexico City Book Fair. And what really drew my attention was to listen to journalists from different parts of the country that were represented in this meeting, and this constant sensation of abandonment. These are journalists that have received threats. Some have even been attacked by public officials. Some have had to leave their states. And this sensation that there is no place where journalists can really weave this network, which is demolishing situation. We think this organization should give journalists this sensation of this fabric of this network. And something else that I wanted to say, something we should preserve, is the spirit of the journalist agenda is collective deliberation system. And a great value, among other things, of the Journalist Agenda program is that journalists were able to sit down to think together jointly on to think about something, all of them together. It was Anabel Hernandez or and people out the province, different states, a young journalist from one of the states of Mexico. We were under conditions of equity, of equality and discussion, and ideas had a similar value. We were debating, we were discussing things in a very orderly manner. I insist, in a very interesting manner to create this. So this idea of being able to deliberate on public issues that attain to journalists' needs, whether they are presidential elections 2018 or any issue. This is a central aspect of the journalist agenda, and I think we should preserve that. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much. So after this 3 presentations, I'm sure that you have ideas that you wanted to share. So please, Annabelle, would you like to take the floor? Would you like to add something? And then we'll hear from the 3, and we'll hear from our audience if you agree. Well, let me just say that this idea, horizontal, and this agenda for journalists, you feel more protected. You don't feel alone, I guess, and I believe that that is one of the first steps that need to be given to have more international organizations, Article 19, the UN, as part of this group, or at least with an eye on what transpires. It's not that you want the act to work. At least what you want is not to be threatened that easily, because I agree. You can grab a gun and kill someone, and, well, people don't think nothing is going to happen, and if they pay me to kill someone, it's even better. That's very dangerous for society, because it's not only against journalists. Yeah, it's a generalized level of impunity, and in the streets, people get killed, and nothing happens. Never. And when something happens, scapegoats are fabricated, and oh, this should be a love crime because these 2 were lovers and that person's husband killed that other one, but no, this is not related to journalism. So this happens because we need to tell young journalists that there is hope in journalism. Inasmuch we contribute as a society, will have better achievements compared to the fact that we are all scattered and alone, and that is part of the strategy to exclude, divide. And I open up this panel with that same statement. The Mexican state includes and excludes according to their needs. Annabelle, I would like to share briefly what my dear colleague and friend Diego said. I dissent. And for me, this is very important, because otherwise we can't understand the status of journalists in Mexico. I do believe that we don't live in a democracy. We live in a pluri-party political system. There are different political parties, yes, but that doesn't mean that we live in a democracy. At least my concept of democracy is that each citizen can feel free to vote for whomever you want. And the latest elections are not necessarily that kind of voting. When citizens vote out of fear, when citizens vote because they have their vote. They have sold their votes. So when we see corruption, when we see an untransparent system, when we see systematic killings, I can't say that we live in a democratic regime. We do have a multi-party political system, yes, where there is an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judiciary, but I don't think that these are not working, and that is what we're living right now. I believe, and this is very important to say, that what journalists are doing, this is not a job that we can do alone, and we should not work solo. Because, oh, people say, oh, freedom of speech, oh, this journalists, they just want to do their own will. That's not how it works. The ones who should defend their freedom of expression and the freedom of getting information are citizens, and I believe that there's a huge divorce here. All of those days where we make conversations about the journalists' agenda, well, I should say, we journalists, we have not given the right priority to that. Yes, we are being killed as if we were flies. Yes, because it's a huge divorce. There's a distance between society and journalists. I'll give you an example that I was shocked. And and I'm ashamed when I share this. This is how I experience it. Last week, I was in Sicily. A journalist from a province of Sicily interviews a local boss. And the interview goes on, the interview finishes without any differences. The journalist with a bat hits the journalist and he hits his nose. So he broke his nose. And that's severe. That's very severe. In Italy, that is not allowed. And to that little city in this province of Sicily, there were thousands on the streets. You had journalists from all over Italy just to complain about a broken nose. And I said, oh, this is minor. Oh, if we should see the same thing in Mexico, if one single citizen would be there demonstrating with a broken nose, we wouldn't have 110 journalists being killed. So with this single example of unity, and this is Sicily, this is a province in Italy where they've suffered bombings, the mafia. Historically, civilians have died between the clash between organized criminals, the state, and some of the state in Italy was in cahoots with the mafia at certain points in history, but this is a society that is strong. This is a society that was able to respond to such an incident. And I was wondering then, what are journalists in Italy doing? So what is the level of civility of citizens that make them react that way? And this is what I would like to highlight. And in the Agenda Periodistas agenda, we talk about this. It is our obligation to create that link once again between journalists and the society that has been broken for many reasons that Diego has well explained. Many people think that, oh, if journalist, quote, air quotes, is López Dóriga a journalist? No, thank you. We're not going to fight for those journalists. That's why they get into that mess. But people create wrong stereotypes of what a journalist is. That's not a journalist. It's not what you see on TV. That's not a journalist, not in Mexican TV at least. Real journalists are the ones in the hinterland doing every day their job in order to give truthful information to the society so the society can make free decisions. And I've seen them. I've seen them for many years in Mexico. I've seen them in the smallest towns and large cities in Mexico. They are out there. That there is where they are. The government, from my very own point of view, has not changed. We never had alternation. The same political system, super corrupt from the PRI, was the same super corrupt government that we had in the PAN. And this super corrupt system is present in every single state in Mexico. It doesn't matter the name of the party. The political regime has not changed. But what has changed in this country? Every day what changes? We have a new generation of journalists. we know what needs to be done, but also new generation of citizens have emerged. And if we change together and if we defend our freedoms together vis-a-vis this political regime that says no to change, here we have an opportunity to change, but we cannot do it by ourselves. And citizens by themselves cannot do it. So we need to work in tandem with civil society organizations, with universities as important as UNAM. We have to create a citizens front against this. And in order to do this, we journalists have to be humble. We need to explain what the Agenda Periodistas agenda is. We have to explain it, and I don't want to get you in any engagement that you don't want, but I hope that all of our conclusions, all of our work, all of our effort is made public. And we, of course, why not put this out for debate? What are your priorities? You should know as well, because at the end of the day, we're working for you. And if we as journalists become more transparent with you and we start connecting with you, this is our code of ethics, at least to have a basic codes of ethics, let's say at least 5 things that are banned, absolutely banned in the smallest town in Mexico and the most important media outlets. At least that, to have a minimum code of ethics, will help us to create this fabric, because we need you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Let me just make a comment on this, at least. My agenda, well, you're younger than me, or, yes, and we were educated in a single media, television, omnipresent, ever-present, always. And we were educated, manipulated, etc., for decades. And we woke up 20 years ago. We realized this was happening. We didn't even realize this was happening in the past, to tell you the truth. So now I think that if all this manipulation they've given us as a recipe, especially since the beginning of television, all these years, perhaps this has made us impune, or it has indolent, ignorant, or we procrastinators on how we can participate in all this. I think this is a different generation. Technologies are allowing now for more democracy, and I do think the social networks have become democratic. There's still manipulation, though. Whenever anyone makes up anything or invents a technology, there's someone else blocking it, or the same person inventing it knows how to use it differently. Now, this opens a panorama, a horizon, a landscape that didn't exist before. So this convening process you are launching here, I think it is extremely important to socialize it as much as possible, to look for people that will adhere to it in highest number of citizens possible, and for citizens to also be asking you, and you say, well, you're asking this from us, but we are asking this from you as well, for it to be a dialogue, an exchange. What do young kids, the millennials, what do they expect, regardless of their age? Because now even youngsters they are come up with saying things that I just used to cry, but now 10-year-olds tell you about the environment. You shouldn't be smoking because of this or that. Before you just be quiet and that's it. But this is not the case anymore. Conditions have changed. Technologies help a lot, although what still prevails, will always prevail, are content. It's content, because technologies change every 5 months. We do not know what's going to be coming 10 years from now. Maybe we're not even going to exist as humans anymore. But the content, that no matter which media, which technology, it has to be something you are conveying or broadcasting or transmitting. So then, what Annabelle was saying, going back to this, what is your opinion on this? Well, I coincide. I share the malaise, the discomfort, the indignation, the outrage that so many of us in this country have in the face of the situation that prevails. That's why I was saying that in formal terms, well, a society today may be under a theocracy, a monarchy, an anarchist communist regime, a dictatorship, or a democracy. And what we have is more similar to is a democracy. That's my view, with all those contradictions that I think are very interesting, because they mean our democracy is more barbaric than any Latin American dictatorship, but in formal terms, it has the elements of a democracy. And I think this is a very contemporary issue, and I've really liked our touching on this is the brilliant expose by Chomsky, where he talked about how democracy is producing things like Donald Trump. The biggest democracy of the world is producing a monster like Trump, and a democracy which is so weak like ours has produced more barbaric actions than any other one. In Colombia, for instance, democracy means they have referendum plebiscites where people are voting for war. I mean, that's what they voted for, and they are putting this into a discussion if people are for peace or war. But people voted for war in Colombia, so there's something that's happening in democracy. And throughout this colloquium, what I have seen through internet precisely, I haven't had the chance to watch everything, but I have seen this questioning, this challenging people are making, and this defense for democracy. For me, this is not defending democracy, and democracy is our salvation or anything like that. I was listening to some of the things that I think are really barbaric. This democracy is good for nothing, and this democracy, it makes us see the dictatorship of the PRI of the last century almost as a democracy. I mean, there's like a game, a mirror type of game here that can be dangerous if this malaise is continuing, and also mixing it with democracy could give way to a dictatorship. And look at what happened in the Russian Federation with Putin after perestroika. Then you see what we now have in the the Russian Federation with Putin. So this is something that really hits us journalists, because that's why important for us to react, for us to really be able to frame the type of system we have. I really love Annabel trying to make a definition that I think we all have to construe a new version of what is happening. In the meantime, that's what I call it, barbaric or weak democracy, whatever. But when they killed Javier, a month after that, I was talking to a friend from Culiacan, another friend from Culiacan, and readdressing what Annabel was saying about the broken nose in Sicily. Well, not many people went to the demonstrations, just a few people. Javier was well known. He got awards in the United States and Rio 12 weekly column and everything, but not many people went to the demonstrations after his death in Culiacan. Not many people, really, just a few. So I and this friend were saying, well, my goodness, this is really terrible. Narcos are worth more than journalists here. What the hellish situation. So we said, well, society prefers money. Money is over everything. More than narcos, it's money, really. We're talking about the narco means money. And money, I think that's what at the core of our lives right now. And democracy, it cannot do anything against money. Something is happening. The democracy is not able to control the dynamics that are being reproduced in the criminal world or even in the legal world, where money is predominating. And there, I believe that the Agenda Periodistas initiative, the way I see it at least, is the 380 people who participated. I see it as a space of resistance. I do not see it as a space that's going to be transforming, that's going to be constructing the new journalistic world. Yes, but it is a space of resistance. And that's what we could aspire to in a situation like the one we have, not only in Mexico, but globally. So then I think it's important to add to what Guillermo was saying, that this coordinating body, this organization that was announced, and the Journalist Agenda, the Chilean moderators helped us with the panels. They said the main thing is for us to create an organization, a coordinating body. And this will also be part of the many other initiatives that are already working. They've been working for many years from the northeastern part. Many other journalists, many other colleagues who are already working. They've already been building spaces of resistance. And this coordinating body, the way we've said it, the way we see it, all of us here coincide. It has to be inclusive and voluntary as well. I mean, individual organizations and individuals can participate. People say, I commit myself to doing this. I want to do this. This is not a deliberation space only. Deliberation in the sense of we're going to be transforming something. You can be part of that space to get yourself organized with other journalists and resist. Because until now, a defense for journalism that's already doing noteworthy work is Article 19 and Reporters Without Borders. Well, they've been doing a lot of very good work. They are NGOs, that's what they are. And here the fundamental thing is the journalists that are organizing themselves to try to defend their work. And at least I see this as a small zone of resistance in the face of everything that's happening, where we're not going to be expecting the creation of the journalists' law as the panacea or the solution for all problems. And these are different actions that are going to be built as this collective deliberation mandates. Yes.
Well, Diego, in this example that you're sharing, that in the funeral of this journalist, not many people, no, the demonstrations, not the funeral. And when a drug dealer is around, there are tons of people around. Oh, you're not afraid of anything. But it's not being a drug dealer, it's money. But there is impunity. Nothing happens. But if you see someone demonstrating, well, you start feeling afraid that you might be killed, as the journalist was. So that might influence at some point. Yes, and as you said, as Donald Trump, some people are vindicating Santana with the sale of Texas. Otherwise, the Bushes would be Mexican, so that would have been terrible. Yeah, we have even worse people than the Bushes. Guillermo. Diego describes the source of resistance. I believe this is a first step, because there is a space at least where people listen to you, you can share, you can analyze what can be done. So what is the next step of this Agenda de Periodistas agenda? And how can you include everyone? And then we'll get questions from the audience. And please share with us, or why not receive an invitation from you. The next step in this agenda is to make public the document, because it's a very long document. We're going to present it in a very nice way so that everybody reading it can understand the context and what are the main highlights. And as Annabelle has said, people will be able to see the complexity and diagnostic that we came with. And secondly, comes the creation of an organization that can summon journalists to participate in deliberations and to join in other efforts that are ongoing and that, from the journalists' point of view, could organize themselves better. I would like to take advantage this idea that has been shared, a space for resistance, because speaking to young journalists, I do believe that we're seeing times where there is extraordinary work in journalism. It's a paradox. At the same time, we have the government, we have this level of simulation and impunity. On the other hand, a generation of journalists, a very broad one, I would say that there are 20 years between the youngest and the eldest. I believe that there's a very interesting space. So they've organized themselves to create spaces for resistance. From investigative journalism spaces like Quinto Elemento, or through better funded organizations like Mexicanos contra la Corrupción, Mexicans Against Corruption, and with new media like Vice, talk to a younger crowd, or by writing books, or by publishing in magazines. In any way, there's a lot of people doing very good journalism.
Very well. If you agree, let's begin our Q&A session. Getting questions from the attendees. There are many questions for whomever, and other more specific for each one of the panelists. So let's start with the general questions for any of you. Because of this harassment, what would be your counsel or message for future generations of journalists? Well, you are going into a complex working or labor world in which there are previous experiences that if you're going to be touching on sensitive issues, you have to get ready for them. You have to prepare yourself to see how to attend to this very sensitive issues and to protect yourselves as well. You're not alone. There are new generations. There are other generations who are older than you, and we are backing the work of young journalists. And as I've said at the end, you're also coming into this in a very effervescent moment. There are options. Not everything is closed and not everything is sealed or protected. And just the last investigations that Annabel mentioned, well, that speaks about a will that exists on the part of journalists to continue doing their work regardless of the circumstances around them. Very well.
Well, we have another question here. Do you have people from the government in journalism? How do you identify infiltrations? Is there a mechanism like a digital print? I think people are smart enough to read a piece to know if it's written by the government, written at Los Pinos, or from the Ministry of the Interior, or from the Office of the Governor, or if this is a piece written by a journalist that actually is describing the truth. Sometimes, yes, you can't find the truth, but you can read that there is an effort, a rigorous effort, to at least describe the facts that are authentic, and I believe that you can see it as in plain sight. Let's say there are outlets that support the official parties, and you don't have to say names or brands. I mean, people know that. So you should be stupid if you see that people are not realizing that. Yeah, there is some controversy with the rights of audiences, and yes, we see a step back in the area on how to warn people that this is official ad. Well, yeah, there are some politicians that cover 8 pages. Of course, it should be there in the teaser. In TV teasers, you should have a banner government ad. But I think that, thanks God, people know where it comes from. Yes, finally. Yeah, we're more keen. Yeah, our generation was asleep. I remember when I started reading newspapers as a kid, I had that bad habit. When I was 10, I read El Norte in Monterrey, and one day it gets to my hands El Porvenir, a different newspaper that was a very good newspaper at that time, and I realized I was very thrilled because I was going to read a different newspaper, and I saw, well, this is the same heading, the same piece. It was the same piece in both. Well, a year ago I did the same exercise, and now newspapers 80% have the same headings, the same headline, the same introduction, the same picture. What does that mean? That the propaganda apparatus works pretty well and journalism is pretty weak. There is no an independent view, so you create this general view. And sometimes journalists, we can be part of the same propagandistic apparatus without knowing it. So writing bulletins and the source, and we reproduce the official discourse without knowing it. We, in the effort, might feel that we're journalists, but there's more scrutiny. There are weights and counterweights. So I felt very strange when I read those different newspapers that year to see if I could see any repetitions. Yes.
For instance, in France, since the kids are going to elementary school, there's a class how to read the media. That's what it's called. So that's what they do. What you said, they put Observador, Figaro, and they say, what does it say this? Why is this same news being reported this other manner in the other newspaper? So kids are very much aware, and they're learning how to avoid being manipulated and how they can use different sources. And this is a lot related to internet, social networks. For instance, this happens, someone publishes something, you don't even bother to check what they're saying or saying what they're saying is true, or what the media has been made up by someone or troll or something. So, well, that's why I insist in media literacy. You have to at least warn people that they have to check sources, they have to look at other versions, not just believe everything they read. Well, I think that, yes, Professor Armando Martinez, do you have any life insurance? Yeah, that's part of the problem. We have no life insurance now. And, Social Security? Do you have Social Security? Well, the family is completely disprotected when something happens in the most extreme cases. The media owners are very selfish. But wait a minute. We're talking about a situation, but let me give you my example because I think this is the constant element, I believe, among journalists, not only the media, not having social protection or life insurance. The insurance companies do not want to give you a life insurance policy. I've been fighting, I've been looking, begging. Look, I want to buy life insurance. If they kill me tomorrow, at least my children will have something. I'm a freelancer. I don't have to reproach anything to my media. I do freelancing journalism, so I myself had to get my life insurance. I'm not even capable of doing that. I put in an application to life insurance company, and they said, no, madam, we're not doing this. I mean, you might get killed any moment. You're not, of course, this would be complete loss. So I don't get a life insurance even if I want one. This is a level of discrimination, not only abuse. The labor level of the people in the media, but this is something that it's even discrimination. Yes, because you're very high risk, and I suppose my case is the case of many other journalists. A journalist, of course, I'm not. She's getting killed tomorrow. I'm not going to be wasting my money on her. The insurance company says insuring a journalist in Mexico is not a very good business.
Last week, I visited Buenos Aires and I was listening to a very well-known journalist. At the same time, she writes for El Clarín, but she's also the editor of an online magazine, Revista en Tibia. And she was complaining about the situation, though she might be kicked out from El Clarín, and she was planning to buy an apartment with the money she would get. And I don't think that will happen in Mexico. No, you won't be given a loan here in Mexico. When you're a high-risk individual, you mean a credit? Oh, yeah. And we should talk about health, but that's a different thing as well. Annabelle, you received a thank you note for the investigation of the True Night of Iguala. And the question is, are there other organizations that are doing the same as you are? And I believe that we've talked about Article 19 and many other organizations. And I believe that it's pretty clear that there are many others that we have not mentioned their names, but I hope that all of those organizations get together. Another thank you note for this panel. There's a student from the Czech Republic, and this student says, I'm sorry for my Spanish, but every time we send our resume, we take it for granted that we write Spanish to 100%, and that's not true. We should specify 90% when we speak and 40% when we write, because everybody says I speak fluent English, and what about Spanish, right? So no one asks if we truly speak Spanish or if we write Spanish properly. So she says that she's working on her thesis on Mexican journalism. And she has a different point of view because she comes from a different country. I have many questions in my mind, but I would like to present this one. What is the most effective way to organize journalists in Mexico that want to do their job properly? How can you protect them? How can you organize them? Because, for example, in the Czech Republic, we have organizations and unions, but I don't know if you can have a union. I don't know if the government allows that to happen. Can you talk about teaching journalism in universities, and what do you think? And this is very important to me.
Well, we've spoken. I don't know where the Czech student is. Where are you? Well, on your questions, though, we've already mentioned a few things here, but I think what we're lacking as well is how is that the universities are teaching journalism right now in Mexico. Are they teaching journalism? How it is that they're teaching it? What are they telling the students? Are they teaching it? What are we doing at the university level with journalism? Well, my experience, well, I see like a lag, a confusion, because the journalism career is communication sciences. That's part of that framework. There's a sort of distortion of the journalistic work. Sometimes the same teacher teaching journalism teaches advertising, publicity. So there's a big distortion on teaching journalism, I think, from the theoretical viewpoint. I'm an attorney, and and I know what a shame. I'm ashamed to say that, but I do have the attorney's license. But I started doing journalism in practice. I mean, I'm self-taught, and if I had paid attention, I never would have done investigation if I had listened to what they were telling me in school. When I teach in universities, I try to fight some teaching methods. I always go to the official source for a story. Well, for me, the official source is always lying by nature. And however, that's the type of thing they teach you. Objectivity, that's another really big lie in journalism, objectivity, and they hammer you with that. Well, objectivity doesn't really exist in journalism. This is an absurd. This is a tool to control journalists at the end of the day, theoretical tool. There's a very long list of absurds, and I think that we would have to add something else, which is the lack of updating. There are universities in Mexico that do not have in journalism. I mean, Kapuczynski, Guillermo Prieto's stories, or Truman Capote, they don't have any of that material, but they have other books. I don't even want to measure what their names are, but they have them, so they Julio Scherer is not being taught at the university level. Guillermo Prieto, for instance, one of our great universal chronicle writers, and I think this is very important, but I think maybe you would be better answering that. Volpe somewhere around here, is he being taught at the university level, for instance? Yes, let me say that the work we've done in the Journalist Agenda program, at one point we invited organizations, other Latin American people to come here to Mexico to share their experiences. What really got my attention is that in other countries, there are 3, 4, or 5 journalistic organizations. And in Brazil particularly, there is one of the owners of the media, another one a union, another one of investigative journalism, and they have ties on common topics. Sometimes they all get together and they organize a big journalists congress, and that's the way they do it. But in Mexico, I cannot explain why there is no journalists organization, and it hasn't been there for a long time. I think this is part of the inheritance of the also part of the heritage of journalism and old school journalism. So I think it would be interesting to see why other organizations have failed and what it is that is happening in Mexico. Yes. And finally, well, you're saying journalists. Well, here what's failed always is the organization of football players. They've never been able to create a union where everyone, I mean, you have unions all over, but you can't do it here because you're not well aligned, because they're doing this, they're putting you on the bench, whatever happens, the penalty and all those things. And it is something that is not strange. It's, however, which are the causes? That's the question. Well, I think this is part of this journalist agenda program that you've created. The second question has to do with, let me take my glasses off. Well, before anything else, they're recognizing the work of all three of you, everything you've told us. And let me say, well, there's a group of journalists here that has been devoted to disqualify your work. Yes, the panelists. And I include myself if they're disqualifying it. Well, I think that what they say that what you do is extremism. No, what you do is, sorry, but I can't really understand this writing within your sphere of work and the level of militant journalism. So the idea here is that there are people that say that you are militants, activists with a negative connotation to those terms. Yes, pejorative, yes. And do you think that in a system where practically the rule of law has disappeared, as a country where something is purchased or bought off, imposing on journalists a very corny, very cheesy way of doing things? Well, the level of social responsibility is in terms of certain political militant leadership, social, maybe, I think the question is asking, are you trying to be social leaders? I think that's what this question is asking. And do you want to have any type of political leadership to a certain degree, being militants, activists? I think this is a very pejorative term.
Well, I think this is a very good topic to discuss. It's a strong question. Well, being militant journalists, well, if I can take something from that question, if that's the reading, there's lack of leadership. So Carmen Aristegui, if she runs for president, she would have high probabilities of winning. She has become a critical figure, a charismatic individual, and that especially she takes advantage of the chaos, the cynicism that we have in our establishment. And that's how she stands out. But I would not consider her, who is the most recognized, the most critical journalist in Mexico as we are. She might be criticized for being militant. I don't consider her to be that. I don't think so. I don't see her next to López Obrador. I don't see her with the Citizens Front. I don't see her participating organically with a power looking for power. I see her bugging power figures, and that is journalism. That the power has been franchised by specific political parties that in between themselves they have agreements, and in this 17 years we have journalists like her, like Annabelle, like I, and many others that were constantly questioning power. That doesn't mean that we identify the opposition leaders with a critical eye, emerging groups, and I believe that that is not the case. And without a doubt, next year we will see that this discussion is going to grow big because we have elections coming. And at least the type of journalism that I do and Carmen's work, my friend Carmen and Annabelle's Carmen, I don't think that their job is to gain power. We're not looking for power. We're questioning and challenging that existing power. And I don't know if the question is oriented more to that effort to organize as Agenda Periodistas agenda. I see Agenda Periodistas as a space for resistance. I believe that the question is that there are other peers, colleagues of yours that see yourselves as like the left-wing journalists, the militants. I'm assuming. The thing is that I couldn't read the question properly. I have something to say.
I think that when we talk about the word militant automatically, and I understand the sense of this question, it seems to be like a pejorative type of sense to this word. However, I do believe that we should each be militant of our own convictions and defend our convictions. Many journalists in Mexico have defended them to death. If you are if being a militant journalist means defending truth, defending freedom of expression, well, you can each of you call it whatever you want. If that's what you're referring to, if you're referring to a militant journalist in a political party or a political trend, I don't think you're absolutely understanding what some of us are doing. And there is a very big number of journalists doing this. So you want to be a militant journalist, militating with truth, with justice, militating with accountability and transparency and the truth. Yes, I consider myself a militant journalist in that sense. I think we have to call things by their names and definitions as well whenever they're required. Yes, thank you very well. Now that I think about it, I am a militant. I didn't remember that I'm part of the sixth declaration of the Lacandon Jungle. So I'm a militant journalist. I signed that statement made by the Zapatista movement, yes. I want to thank all of you, all three of you. Thank you so much for your participation. I want to thank UNAM for this colloquium, which is international, siege and civilization, especially this one, harassment siege on journalism. And I want to thank the coordination and Dr. Volt, everyone watching us on television or the streaming or any means, the different mobile platforms. Thank you so much for your attention. And I do not know if you have any last comments, remarks, or should we finish this? Well, let me say something. I'm sorry there's no microphone. We cannot hear here in the interpretation booth. I am so sorry.
existe todavía este rezago. Claro, no lo resarcen, pero es un esfuerzo de un grupo de profesores, de investigadores, por acercar, y lo que decía Guillermo, ¿no? La deliberación de estos temas que me parecen importantísimos, que bueno, pues también agradecer siempre esto ayuda, y el mensaje a los nuevos periodistas, ¿no? Que me parece ahí, dentro de todos estos acosos, la situación laboral, lo que dijiste, Anabel, pero también cómo pues darles un mensaje, ¿no? Es decir, creo que hoy el periodismo de investigación resurgió, lo discutíamos hace unos días, el tema del trabajo colaborativo, ¿no? Que no se tocó, pero que hoy está abriendo puertas y que se hacen investigaciones de continente a continente. En fin, creo que hay muchísimas, pero esta parte, ¿no? De decir si hay un esfuerzo de la universidad, especialmente por reconciliar y generar actividades.
Muy bien, pues,
Yes, very well. So, did you participate in the Journalist Agenda event?
Es otro tipo de acoso, la inestabilidad, la parte, ¿no? de esto del freelance que ahora se ha abierto, pero que tiene que ver con una responsabilidad del medio, y justamente lo que hace Horizontal, ¿no? En esta profesionalización de la capacitación a los profesores.
sí, muy bien, yo creo que
Yes, thank you. I think, yes, are we really freelancers? I mean, that's what we all are. I mean, finally, we we made our own choices, of course, and we're moving on with our own choices. Of course, I am 62 and I'm not regretting anything. I am not repenting, and we're moving on, no matter what. Well, thank you. We want to thank everyone here. Thank you so much for being this panel. Thank you, panelists. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Good afternoon.
Muy bien,
Diego.
muchas gracias.
qué gusto
Igualmente.
estar aquí con ustedes. Anabel.
Gracias, Gracias, muchas gracias.
Agradecemos mucho su asistencia esta tarde y los invitamos a la última mesa de este coloquio aquí en la universidad. Es a las 5 de la tarde en este mismo salón, Arte y Cultura como Formas de Resistencia. Participarán Tsitsi Dangaremga, Federico Navarrete, Marisa Velastegui Goitia y Luis de Tavira. Aquí los esperamos. Gracias.